Hello, everybody, and welcome. Happy Tuesday. I think it's Tuesday, midday. Hope everyone's well. Thank you, everyone that's watching, both live and on demand. And welcome to this special Rebuilding Fairly panel debate from the OpsNets in partnership with myself and powered by PSP. We've got a fantastic panel lineup where I'm going to introduce you in just a moment. If you're watching live on LinkedIn or YouTube, then let us know by adding a note in the comment section. And please, we want this to be interactive. So if you have some comments or questions of the panelists, then please do get involved. So without further ado, in no particular order, I'm going to introduce my first panelist, and that is Michael Adeniya. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, absolutely fine, Dan. How are you?
I'm good. So Michael, you're the Chief Operating Officer at the UK Black Business Show, the EMEA Diversity and Inclusion Business Lead at Clarion Events, and also Chair of the D&I Working Group at the EIA. So welcome to you, Michael. And next up is Stacy Moore. Hi, Stacy.
How you doing there, Dan?
I'm very well. Nice to see you. So Stacy is the Director and Lead Chartered Psychologist of Inner Circles. Right. Who work alongside companies who have a genuine commitment to understanding and better supporting the emotional health and well-being of their workforce. And you're also the founder of the Nesting Coach for maternal mental health.
That's absolutely right.
Excellent. Yeah. Glad I got that correct. And finally, a lady that probably doesn't need any introduction to most people watching, but we'll do it anyway. The lovely Lou Kiwanuka. Hi, Lou.
Hey, Dan. How you doing?
I'm good. So Lou obviously is the founder of the Shaper Group, the OpsNest, who are obviously putting on this special open session, as well as the chair of ESSA and the EIA. So welcome, Lou. So hello, panelists. Hope everyone is well today. So without further ado, and we have quite a few people watching, so thank you very much. The session is called Rebuilding Fairly, so all about fairness. And obviously it's going to be with reference to the events and exhibitions industry, but I guess generally in society because the two go together. I've had a look this morning at the Cambridge English Dictionary and how it defines fairness. I don't have a copy of it, it was online. They define it as the quality of treating people equally or in a way that is right or reasonable. I'll start off with you, Michael. Do you resonate with that? What's your definition of fairness?
Yeah, treating people equally. And yeah, the what's right and reasonable, that's really interesting. And firstly, so it's such a timely conversation to have around fairness right now, and obviously rebuilding fairly. One term I don't want to hear anymore is building back better. That term is doing my nutting. But building back fairly, I think is very, very relevant to where we're at today. While organisations, as I say, everyone is building back. Things are ramping up. We're getting back into live events. Super exciting. At the same time, companies' values are massively under scrutiny with the people that work in those organizations, as well as the people that trade with those organizations and those applying to work with those organizations as well. So what does fairness mean? For me, and in terms of the roles that you just described that I'm holding right now, it's all about the fairness in the opportunity for all. Where I'm coming from is around the underrepresented groups, those that whose voice isn't as heard as others at the table, and how do organisations that are now recognising that they need to work better at that? How do they bring fairness to the forefront as they're building back and scaling back up?
Sure, it's interesting, and Stacey, I'll come to you next because. Like anything, if we talk about fairness or we talk about economic, how we feel and how that's going to be impacted, it's the personal and also there's the macro, right? So it's how it affects you and how it affects the wider society. What's your, as a psychologist, how do you define fairness?
Yeah, well, I think Michael just hit the nail on the head about the current context that we're in. Really within society, COVID has really shown the stark disproportionality as to how something as COVID has affected society. So the fact that we are looking at fairness now allows us to recalibrate and think, okay, well, this massive thing has highlighted such disproportionality, which was already there, but has been magnified by the events of COVID. How do we resolve that now? Any interaction that we have on an organizational level or on an individual level, fairness is really a social contract, isn't it, between two entities or more. And so we really have a duty to think about, well, how do we both walk away, whether organizations or individuals interacting, how do we both walk away from those transactions feeling psychologically well? How do we walk away from any transaction we don't feel like we've been duped or we've got one over on somebody? How do we walk away from transactions and we all feel like we are getting what we need? We're getting our values met, we're getting our needs met. How do we walk away from those transactions feeling well? And so, yeah, I think it's time for us to look at some truths within all of our industries. Actually, it's not just the events industry, all industries. I think a spotlight has been really highlighted on how things are not necessarily fair and how we can do things better. So for me, fairness is about ensuring emotional, psychological wellness in all of the interactions and transactions that we have, whether financial, emotional, whatever they are, whatever those transactions are.
Thank you. And Lou, same question to you then about fairness and how you define it.
So we've been spending the last two months or so on and off talking in the Ops Nest about fairness and what that means. So we've done quite a bit of work on within our own industry. How could we create more fairness, and what does that mean? And ultimately, it seems to come down to expectations. There's a lot of unwritten expectation or a lack of knowledge about how contracts are negotiated and what the underpinning frameworks under contracts. There's just simply aren't known, and it's getting worse because there's a whole bunch of experience that's left our industry, and therefore we've got a bunch of people that are negotiating, procuring with each other, and the very basis of our industry at points is not fair. How we tender, how we establish those terms, that contractual transaction, we've identified as being the core focus of what we're talking about.
Thank you. And obviously COVID hit about 18 months ago, and for the first sort of 6 to 8 weeks, everyone seemed to be in it together, and it was almost like a level playing field. Michael, COVID at that time was a great leveler, and maybe it was creating some sort of parity in society. Do you think it's now actually accentuated the gap between the haves and have-nots, or have there been positives from it in terms of fairness and equality in society?
What do you mean in terms of how? What when the pandemic first hit?
Yeah, and where we are now.
Yeah. I mean, the pandemic created an awareness for a great deal of individuals and organizations. A lot of individuals went on their own journey of pain through the pandemic. Everyone has suffered in some sort of way in the last 18 months, which when you talk about that sense of belonging, it, as you say, it created that platform that we are all in this together. And then you're right that there is still the gap is still there in various pockets of society. Those that, as you say, the haves and have-nots. Those that have and those in positions of power, they are becoming aware that power gap exists. Turning that awareness into action, though, is, I believe, where some organizations are trying to step into now, some faster than others, but really closing that gap is going to be really hard work. If you look at the event organizers, for example, we in the roles that you mentioned, if I go in reverse order from how you announced them, that's actually the order that they kind of came about. So I had conversations with the AEO around the lack of diversity in our industry, and presented to them some of the work that Clarion Events had been doing, and education that from the leadership team and downwards had in trying to rebuild an inclusive organization. And it resonated strongly because, as an event industry, we do lack diversity, but we also have an opportunity to to create inclusive environments in so many sectors, because we create events in basically every sector that has also been hit by this pandemic as well. So I think when I started having those conversations with the AEO, that's where the D&I working group was born from, in terms of how do we within our organizations look at what diversity and inclusion looks like, and creating opportunities for those that don't have a voice, creating opportunities for career progression, but also how do we create diverse and inclusive events for our sector, for the sectors that we represent as well. So, the awareness has begun, but now there are groups being set up, as the EIA and the AEO, as well as organizations themselves, in turning that awareness into action. It's really, really hard work, and it is a case that that's something that each of these organizations really need to be bold in and clear in exactly what their intentions are in changing that gap.
Sure, thank you. And Stacey, obviously you work outside of the event sector, so it's very interesting to get your insight. I think specifically within the educational space. How have you seen things develop over the last 18 months? Because obviously, COVID gave us all a pause for thought. We were working from home, and it was all fine. And now, we're going back to the office, and some companies want people back. And don't. How are you finding things in the sector that you operate in mostly?
Yeah, I think education has a natural pause at the moment. So I guess leading up to that natural pause, I saw a lot of stress, huge increase in how people were acting and working in different ways, and having to be very adaptable. I've seen a continuation, unfortunately, even though we've sat and we've reflected on how people may be disproportionately affected by the pandemic. We've seen a continuation of some of those things still happening, and even though the awareness is there, we're still quite not sure how to change it. So, we've got the government, for example, talking about, children need to be in school for longer days, and that will adjust the balance. Or, we need to just make sure that we're working from home and we can have additional lessons so that might address the balance. I think what we need to be doing, and it might be counterintuitive because it feels like, we need to fix the problem now. I think it's about sitting with the problem for a little bit longer and scrutinizing what the problem is, and consulting with the very people that this stuff affects the most. So in the example I just gave about within education, I'm not sure many people have actually sat down with the kids themselves and worked out, people or even older learners, like, well, what is it that you've missed out on? What is it that you need? And even just assessing, what data do we have right now to kind of have a look at the difference in outcomes? And within industry, what are the differences in terms of recruitment? What are the differences in terms of stress levels of our staff? We need to scrutinize the data and then act on the data that we have in front of us. Otherwise, we kind of, I think the risk is that we end up creating the system that was already created in the first place, which is not what we want to do at all. And we're thinking we're doing it with the best of intentions. But from the psychological perspective and understanding of neuroscience, we know that when we are, stressed and rushing to do stuff, actually we're relying more on our biases. We're being far too frenetic in the way that we're addressing a problem. We need to slow ourselves down, allow our amygdalas to work, and to really scrutinize what the problem is and come up with a healthy menu of solutions that are far more long-term and not just knee-jerk, and a bit like, government needs to take its nose out of education. I think a lot, maybe legislation can be helpful in some areas, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, but I think slow down, stick with the problem, find out from the people who are most poorly affected or most definitely affected by this pandemic before we think about, what we do next, because that's only fair, right?
Absolutely. And Lou, I think you agree. Stacey makes a good point. I mean, in anything, when you're trying to affect change, you need to speak to the people that need that change? It seems obvious, right? It's just an obvious thing rather than just going off and do it. Related to the events industry specifically, do you think we do that enough? Do you think we consult, people on the ground, whether it's organisers or suppliers, and actually understand their needs and what they want to change?
No, I don't think we do at all. I've probably been in the game about 25 years, and I'm learning this now by asking different questions I haven't asked for 25 years. So no, and I don't think I'm alone in that. I think our industry runs at such a pace normally that we don't have time to ask those questions. But also, when the industry is running at full pace, almost the negative effects of some of the expectations we have of each other are just soaked into the cost base of the show. They're not brought out into the open. And something that Stacey is saying, almost you need to shine a light on the issues and keep it there for a little while to start to understand the problem. A perfect example is I don't think organisers have a very clear view at all, or exhibitors, of just how much it costs contractors to tender for an event, to tender for a piece of business. So we've been doing a bunch of work and asking some of our suppliers to tell us, okay, what's the ballpark for the stand? What's the ballpark for an event? And some of these events, or some of the events and the larger stands, you could be looking at £10,000 for a company to put a tender in. We are not shining light on that. We're not understanding where our expectations are requiring people to invest money. And I think now is a perfect time because, every contractor needs to get bang for their buck that they're investing in getting business. And now is why we're having this conversation. Such a great time to have the conversation. Because rebuilding fairly levels at every element. It's our core, it's our values, it's how we conduct business, but it's how we recruit, it's how we rebuild our industry, people, and what we want for our future. It's perfect. I'm going to say it like pivot point hopefully for our industry if we decide to take up the challenge.
Sure. And I mean, it's interesting you say that. So playing devil's advocate, one side of the argument, it was the perfect opportunity. The other side might be, well, I haven't been able to run an event. Let's talk about events for a minute. For 18 months, my priority now is commercial imperative. I don't have the time for all these other soft issues, somebody might say. Michael, how realistic do you think it is at this time to affect change, whether in some big topics here, diversity, whether it's people working from home, mental health, maternity and paternity leave, which we spoke about on our pre-call. Do you think the industry's got what it takes to affect this sort of change?
No. Move on. No, I don't think it does. And the reason being is it's when you look at the big organisers, they're only responsible for a fraction of the shows, right? Sure. So many organisers are small, family-run, individual businesses that have not been able to turn over a penny in 18 months. Like it's really painful. And if you're the leader of an organisation like that, then clearly you might have staff. You might have 10, 20 staff that you want to pay wages to, and unfortunately, the bottom line is absolutely vital. I've been fortunate that a number of when I was at Clarion, for example, I know that they were in a relatively fortunate position that just getting a show out the door is success. Just it's symbolic to the industry for some of these shows to just happen, and that creates an element of a safety net, an element of collaboration. We're all in this together, but the big 3 or 4 are only responsible for a small fraction of the shows. So when you're a small individual business that is desperate to just claw back and just keep alive, and even leaders within organizations like Informa and Clarion, they can't put fairness and diversity at the top of their agenda. It's just simply it simply doesn't it's not going to land on them right now.
Sure, thank you. And Stacey, what Michael says actually comes back to maybe why be fair, or actually what's in it for me as an individual or an organization small or large. Why should organizations be fair?
It's a really good point, Michael. Unfortunately, I'm feeling really depressed now. It's so.
I did have there was I could have added a part 2 to that, but I like that mic drop element, and let's see how we bounce back on this together. Yeah,
but there has to be a reward, right? Rightly or wrongly, organisations, individuals, very few are probably truly altruistic. They need something back. I know you mentioned 3 or 4 pillars of fairness when we spoke before, so maybe you can bring something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important that you raise that point, Michael, because ultimately we're all hardwired for fairness. It's something that we learn from the playground, if not before. There are physiological responses that happen to us when we see unfairness taking place. For a lot of us, that might be our very, very core value. So if we see someone getting swindled, like we have a visceral response to it. And so I think we need to tune into some of those, that core of us that, when we see unfairness happening, actually it triggers that feeling of disgust. But perhaps if we are using within our branding that fairness is something that we do and we're really explicit about it, in the same way that, in the 80s, fair trade was one of the big things that was out there, and consumers were buying into this, but not just the consumers behind the scenes, everybody else, that tripartite had to exist behind the scenes, that people bought into, the suppliers bought into, organizations bought into. It was something that was seen as really tangible and created that altruistic, good, comforting, wonderful feeling, as opposed to that feeling of disgust. And once you shine that spotlight to say, hold on a minute, things are really unjust, you can't unsee it. And I wonder if maybe shining that light and showing some of the organizers, suppliers within those packs that you have to put together to tender for the business, showcasing some of those some things that you are doing that are positive in terms of achieving fairness, is actually quite it's a provocative thing in terms of it's a positive thing to attract people to. It's a positive, warm, fuzzy feeling created by something. And I know that's quite intangible, particularly when you are desperately trying to reach a bottom line. I get that, but it's something that we as humans are kind of triggered to tap into, even subconsciously, to see that organizations are tangibly celebrating what they do to move towards fairness. It is something that is positive and can actually move the needle, I think, even if it's on a subconscious level.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there's been many occasions where society has shifted their views, even on recycling, whether
Absolutely.
It's types of food. However cynical you are, there have been big changes and big shifts, which on the macro level, people would argue is for the good. Lou, do you think it boils down to reward and or punishment, like binary? So, if you change this, you're going to get a reward. If you don't, you might get punished. Or do you think there's more nuance than that?
Yes, I think there would need to be. There needs to be some form of legislation, I think, which is kind of coming through, or some kind of code of conduct for our industry to set what the benchmark might be. But going back to what Stacy mentioned about the kind of fair trade of the 80s, when we originally set out to look at what this looked like, what we wanted to do was create a trade fairly label for the event industry, where organisations across the board, organisers, venues, and the supply chain can kind of go, this is something that we are committed to. And it is aspirational. It doesn't, it's soft. However, I do think it's worth mentioning, in the state of the industry that we've got now, where pragmatism has to take hold because there aren't enough people to do the jobs. There isn't enough skill on the show floor to create these shows. the supply chain will be choosing the people to work with who they trade most fairly with. It will be the common denominator by which people make decisions going forward. And if they have been treated unfairly, those contracts will be the first to be unfulfilled. So, and that's why I think this is a perfect moment to be talking about this topic, because those need to show what fair is. And then we need to ask all of our industry to level up to that. And then those that do not, fair enough, they can plough their own path, but at the jeopardy of not being able to run their event as efficiently as everybody else.
Sure.
Anyway.
You talk about a manifesto. Obviously, the Ops Nest put out the book about green ideas, right? The little big, I can't remember the phrase, sorry, little green book of green ideas.
Little bit of big green ideas.
That's it. So, which obviously is affecting change. So, are you suggesting that there'd be like a fairness manifesto? Is that something you guys are going to be involved with? What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so at the moment, our kind of next support is going to spit out a checklist, a template for tendering in the fairest and most holistic way possible, identifying things like diversity, inclusivity, fair pay, fair trading. And the other thing is we've been talking about kind of like top 10 tips for organisers, top 10 tips for the supply chain about how they could alter slightly to trade on a fairer basis. It all comes back down to expectations.
Sure.
What you're asking of somebody or what you're agreeing to, but maybe not mentioning a couple of things. All those kind of elements are in the top 10s. So yeah, we would love for those top 10s to be a manifesto or code of conduct or something like that we can all aspire to.
Sure. And we've got a comment here from Derek Talent, who has said we need organisers to start playing fair with the supply chain. Michael, do you have a view on that? Do you think there's more to be done with regards to the relationship between suppliers and organisers?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's a load of work that it's a change of mindset, though, isn't it? And I think a manifesto is definitely something that can start making the steps towards that. But yeah, that whole consideration of fairness is something that Stacy kind of mentioned earlier. We do start with a fairness sort of imprint on us from a really young age, and that might vary from people to people. Quick sort of story about me. I came from a family where actually my mum was the sort of main breadwinner in our household. So the stereotypical male being the breadwinner that earns the most. That wasn't the sort of household I grew up in, and that wasn't what I accepted as just the norm. So that's always kind of rung true in everything that I've done, and that's been the lens that I've looked at life through. So, for example, when me and my wife were having kids, and shared parental leave was available, it was a no-brainer for me to take shared parental leave. Whereas for 99% of men, it wouldn't be a go-to. In the UK, that wouldn't be the go-to. That isn't normal in the UK. So everyone's got that sort of a varying base level of what fairness might look like to them. As you move into a position where you're a decision maker, where you hold the budget, and you're moving up the career ladder, your objectives change from whatever you might have been born with. It's just is what it is, right? So how do we as an organization try to level that playing field? And there might be an element of legislation that might need to be put into place to support that. If you look at the US, for example, I can't organize an event in Miami without the contractors having a labor agreement where they're paid a minimum. They're paid by the minute pretty much to move a box. And you know what? That's just what the playing field is in the US.
Yeah.
And that's their way of creating fairness. Whereas we over here can negotiate, and we've got this hierarchy where yeah, the hierarchy is that the organizer holds the power. But then do we need mechanisms in place to balance out that power in order to make it fair?
Thank you. Stacy, in your line of work, I mean, maybe you can just bring to life some examples of, you've gone into a setting where they wanted to affect change. They weren't quite sure how to do it. Did you implement things like manifesto? How do people go about it in your area?
Yeah, interesting question. Within the contracts as psychologists, when we draw up contracts with our clients that we work with, something within it is called the psychological contract. So that's really the unspoken stuff, the stuff to do with how we maintain like a positive working relationship. What are the mutual expectations and beliefs and obligations that we have? What's the transparency amongst us? What are we ensuring that we're transparent about, and how are we going to communicate about those things? How do we ensure that there are ethical practices happening between us? And it's about scheduling in those conversations at the start when we are actually contracting, but also when we review and see, well, how's this going for you? So not necessarily at the end, but how is this going for you? Are we meeting this contract? Is this contract working for both of us? So I guess that is one example. But also to respond to what Michael was saying, this and also what Lou was saying, the carrot and the stick thing is not necessarily going to shift people into doing this. One of the things that I love this title within our role as psychologists is that we're supposed to be critical friends. When we're working in a consultative capacity, we are the critical friend. Now, yeah, critical friend, I'm not sure on a day-to-day basis if one of my friends was highly critical all the time, I'm not sure how much longer they would be a friend for. But that you are buying in, that is part of the contract in a psychologist holding people to account, having reflective conversations where you are forced to stop and reflect on some of your decisions that you have made and hold yourself to account with those, with an impartial being. So that's often what we do as psychologists if we're having supervision sessions, or even if we're negotiating contracts with organizations or with individuals. It's really important to have that accountability from somebody impartial. And I'd also suggest that perhaps within the events industry, you have the idea of signing up to accountability partners. So you make time within, if you're both suppliers, you make time to actually have conversations, to think of creative ways of eliciting fairness. If you're organizers, you meet together and have. So, there are ways and means. I think it takes creative thinking to make this stuff happen. And it's not just about carrots and sticks. It's about how we hold each other to account, or how we hold ourselves to account, and who these critical friends are within the industry that, within the events industry. It may be different professionals. It might not be psychologists. It might be somebody else. Sure.
But it's actually interesting because I think, Lou, as well, it's good to get an insight from outside the industry, because we all talk to each other. It's in the UK specifically, it's fairly close knit. If we talk about exhibitions, come across the same people all the time. Do you think it's maybe the industry hasn't looked outward enough, for how other industries have changed, and enlisting support of people like Stacy and others?
Yeah, and I don't think we look inwards enough as well. As in, I think again, it sometimes comes back to you pace. Sometimes we don't take the time to reflect how a decision that we've made or something that we have done has negatively affected the companies that we work with. And I appreciate there's probably people listening to this that go, yes, and you did that to me, and I totally did. And that's why I have made some terrible mistakes in my career that I know have cost people money, and sometimes they've never said it. But now, looking back reflectively, I know that I have made decisions that have been incorrect and have damaged somebody else or somebody else's business. And thankfully, most of them still want to work with me again. But I think it does come back to some reflection, education, knowledge, understanding that the deeper layers of how our industry interacts with each other. And it would be awesome for us to become a bit more open about how we're trading. So
Sure.
coming back to kind of our top 10s, our top 10 for the supply chain and contractors also includes some things that our supply chain could be doing that could help them to not be affected negatively, but also how to trade fairly through the organizer as well. So it's not all organizer to supply chain. There's a whole bunch of re-education and knowledge work that could be done before we even start looking at actively pushing a needle somewhere. We could just level up pretty easily by just becoming a bit more knowledgeable.
Sure. No, I think you make a good point. Just to say, people that are watching, if you have a question or comments for the panel, then please do put them in the comment section. We asked a poll a few days ago on LinkedIn. What do you think our industry needs to level up in most to create a stronger workforce for the future? 40% said working hours, 40% said diversity, and 20% said welfare on site. Michael, what's your view? If we've got a crystal ball and we look forward in 12 months' time, what do you think the one or maybe two areas that the industry needs to level up, if we could use that phrase again, and mostly?
Some of the points that Stacy and Lou have made, I thought was so interesting around, what was the term again, Stacy? The friend, the
critical friend.
The critical friend. I think back at some of the people I've worked with over the years that I'm thinking back that there have been internal critical friends in some of the things in some of the events that I've worked on. However, as you say, being a critical friend is a really vulnerable position to be when everyone wants to move quickly. Decisions need to be made, and no one really wants you to slow them down. And I've been in situations where that critical friend has said the thing that we were all thinking it, we were going to glaze over it, but now it's out there. And those people are so brave.
Sure.
But so how do we as an industry create a space where we recognize that actually helps us be better? I know that there's various organizations that decided that at one point they should have a code of ethics for their own brand. And some of the issues that might arrive on site or between suppliers could have been eradicated if we, as an internal, as you say, Lou, look internally. Well, how do we look internally, but then also have something that keeps us accountable to that internal agreement, internal contract that we all agree to? And a code of ethics is definitely one of them. So I think of the people that have implemented code of ethics as being so brave in creating that. As organizations, though, it's all part, I believe it's all part of being inclusive. It's all part of those in a position of power accepting that, I might be the most senior person in the room, but that doesn't mean that my voice is the most important one. Getting a range and diverse range of voices to the table should be what the future of leadership looks like, the future of events look like as well. And so that's why, I understand why and appreciate why 40% have said diversity and inclusion is really important there.
Sure.
So that one stands out a lot for me.
Thank you. Because also, Lou, you've mentioned this many times, working hours, which has come up quite high at 40%, especially in ops, they're expected to do whatever it takes, which could be working to 1, 2 in the morning, working all the way through on site, off site. Obviously, if they're full-time employees, they get extra pay for that. Going into the minutiae, is that something you think should change?
I think it's a big topic, isn't it? Because it will unsettle how much contracts are worth and all that element. But yes, absolutely. I know some of the biggest kind of names in operations. If you went to some of the best ops people in the country and were asked them what they actually got paid on some of their contracts, it would be like less than £5 an hour for sure.
Yeah.
And when it comes to creating an industry that is attractive to everybody, no matter what background they're from. You can't do that on £5 an hour. Like, you know, my son, he's 14, he even like raises an eyebrow when I ask him to do something for less than £5 an hour. I think it has to be part of the discussion. However, I mean, I'm a business owner, and I know that trickles down through my own business as well. It's not something I like. But, you know, we all see it on job adverts. My own included is this isn't a 9-to-5 industry. You will be expected to work long hours, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, and that's where, how do we find the medium happy ground between the trade unions of America, where you're getting, you know, you're paying through the nose and sometimes unfairly in that, to where we are now, where some of our finest ops people in the country they're being paid much less than minimum wage.
Sure. And thank you. And Stacey, in terms of legislation, and obviously there's been many areas where the government have stepped in for the good, you know, maternity, paternity leave, living wage. Do you favour legislation, or do you think it's too much of a blunt instrument?
Oh, that's a provocative question, isn't it? I think right now, given the scope of the pandemic, showing that highlight of disparity, we do need something. We do need for there to be the government stepping in and saying and giving some sort of blanket guidance. But in consultation, what we don't want to happen is that events organisations or any organisation is feeling very done to. We're not going to comply with guidance or legislation if we're not part of it. So I know that there have been lots of consultations in the past, and I think to a large extent it tends to be lip service. Some real genuine consultation with all of the areas of people involved in the supply chain of events need to be involved in this consultation. But even before that, even before we get there, because legislation takes time, there are lots of bodies that you all belong to as events. What are those bodies saying? What are your organisational bodies saying as guidance? What's the voice of your profession saying as guidance? And I think it's really phenomenal that Lou has put together, or is putting together, in the process of putting together this checklist, because the great thing about legislation is that it gives a real clear framework as to what you should and shouldn't do. Great, but it can be restrictive. If we're taking that similar mechanism and applying it on a less meta position, but within the organization industry, and it's something that you're all involved in creating, then suddenly we have a shortcut to the critical friend. The critical friend suddenly exists within a template, within a formulation that is written, and not a person having to raise their head above the parapet and be so brave. It's everybody buying into, well, this is what we sign up to. This is what our business represents. So let's run through the checklist before we kick off. Okay, halfway through, let's just do a bit of a checklist check. It becomes easier. There's a shortcut to doing it that doesn't involve somebody being, really stepping and raising their head above the parapet. So I think that's more what needs to happen right now. Maybe once that has happened and this guidance has embedded, and more events organisations have taken it on board, take it to the legislators then, because it's already embedded and you've worked on it. It's something that will be useful for you, as opposed to being done to. It's something that you have created and then you've taken it to the powers that be.
Sure. And Michael, what can, obviously we've spoken about organisations and groups of people, what can an individual do to affect change, do you think? If someone sees something they don't like, not necessarily whistleblowing, but what can they do to be a force of positive change, if you like?
Yeah, it is that sort of critical friend aspect, isn't it? That at the moment, that those that can speak up where they feel that a change is needed. It might be individual, or it could just be asking the right questions to get that, to just to just raise the awareness or create conscious space for people to recognize that something isn't fair, whether it's at a contract stage or whether it's internally within their organization or just in the build up of the look and feel of your event. Like, having those voices is really quite valuable. And I think Stacey raised a good point around how can that evolve into industry or into the associations that represent our industry. I've seen various individuals probe the Kiwanukas, the Chris Skeefs, and say, I think something needs to be done about this. And the EIA, the AEO, and etc., they are listening. And I should be careful about how I say this, but associations, it's like turning a barge. It can be difficult, but with enough probing, things can get done. Like, the fact that there's now an EIA D&I working group, that was born, less than 9 months ago, and it's the only new working group created last year. So that is, the first signs that change is happening, and there is coordination between the venues, the suppliers, and the organisers as well. So, the more that individuals can speak up, ask the right questions to the right people, or collectively asking questions to the right people as well, is really powerful.
And actually, the EIA working group, if people aren't aware, and maybe I'll ask this to you, Lou, because obviously I think you're the chair of it. How do individuals in an organisation get involved, as opposed to just the senior people on those organisations?
So there are a number of different working groups, either under each individual association or cross association, like Michael's just said about the diversity and inclusion one. Ultimately, for you to be part of it, you need to be a part of an organisation that belongs to that association for a start. But you can just simply put your name forward to the secretariat for the associations and say that you've got a passion for this and you want to make an active difference. Nobody wants anybody on these working groups that just wants to sit there so they can put their name on it. So I'd advise if you're going for kudos, then don't bother. Like if you're occupying a seat at one of those tables, it's a position that of influence and opportunity, and knock your socks off. Go make a difference. That's how I've really benefited from being part of the associations. To be sat at a table, discussing, mulling things over, and working towards something better.
And Lou, I'll come to you again. If we're sitting here in 12 months' time, what would you have liked the priorities? What would you have liked to have seen changed, and how are you going to measure that between now and then?
Well, obviously the whole industry would be signed up to our kind of top 10 tips for organisers and contractors and our kind of code. That would be great. I think kind of coming back to what Michael and Stacey have both said around how do you affect change. Within all of these things, I think there has to be an attitude of empathy, because we are not all perfect. And I am still not perfect. I've recently gone through a tender process where, even though I was writing the top 10 tips, I still didn't nail it. There's various different reasons. Nobody's ever going to be perfect. And I think the worst thing we could do is create a framework by which we can all beat each other with. It's not about that. It's about supporting each other to level up. So, as a good example, I would love it if at the bottom of a tender thing that comes in from a contractor to an organiser, if there was just a note that said, just FYI, we're not going to charge you, this one's on us, but it costs us £2,000 to put this together, just so you know.
Yeah.
To raise the knowledge, raise the education. I think until we can raise the knowledge and the education, it's going to be hard to put in place anything that might beat, because you are literally beating a whole bunch of people that just don't know. They just don't understand it. What they're doing is impacting in a negative way on someone else. So give us a year. Let's get the knowledge and the education up. Let's make sure that every person in an ops team or an event manager has a basic understanding of how what they're asking creates on the other side. And let's make sure that all of our supply team understand that what they're saying needs to deliver, or they can't just tuck in something at the back end. So yeah, that's my thing.
Yeah. So thank you so much, panel. We've come to the end of a fascinating discussion. Obviously, we just touched on a lot of topics, but I think everyone agrees that change needs to happen in a number of areas, and we've spoken about a number of ways to do that. Michael, you've just taken on a relatively new position as the CEO of the Black Business Show. Just tell us about that show and when it is happening, please.
Yeah, so UK Black Business Show is taking place in October. It's going to be a live event. There will be a hybrid element, but Raphael Sofaluk, the CEO, founded that show in 2017 because he, a lot of great ideas come from an element of what's the status quo. There's a conflict. Need to find a resolution.
Sure.
And at that time, he was struggling, and his friends were struggling to find an environment where Black professionals or Black entrepreneurs could network, share ideas, and for individuals to progress, to get tips on how to progress their careers or how to even start their own businesses. So that show's kind of doubled year on year. Obviously, we were hit by the pandemic last year, so it didn't run. But we're really excited about not only launching building on the UK Black Business Show, which is a one-day event on the Saturday, but actually wrapping it up with UK Black Business Week, that each day of the week for the last week of October has a really specific focus in different industry verticals to elevate Black voices in the business space. So it's
we wish you the best of luck for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm sure it's a big role, but it looks like it's going to be a great show. And Stacey, with regards to yourselves in the future, and if people want to reach you in terms of inner circles, just bring that to life a little bit, please.
Yeah, so we've been focusing very much on well-being, generally employee well-being. But the nesting coach has really brought to the fore the disparities for working parents, in particular working mothers. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing at the moment is supporting people who are going, that I think that is great, right on cue. It's one of the things of working from home. But if people were interested in supporting their workforce who are also parents, to have reflective supervision, reflective space, but not necessarily just those who are parents, that importance of reflective space is true of so many people with all of the various things we are juggling in lives, then you can reach out that way. And also on social media, been through a bit of a lull, but there will be a bit more information online from the Nesting Coach. If people want to follow me on social media, I'm on Instagram and on Facebook, but also, of course, on LinkedIn, which is where we are today.
Thank you. It's been a real treat, actually, Stacey, to have someone from outside the industry and with your experience and expertise on the panel. Lou, just final word from you. What's next for the Ops Nest and your various other ventures?
So you can also find the kind of Nesting Coach and a couple of bits of downloads within our baby nest. So we've got a little space within the Ops Nest for corporates to house people that are on maternity leave, particularly in the return to work phase. And Stacey's working with us on that. But in terms of the Ops Nest, we're just always about trying to educate and give more knowledge to our industry through the supply chain and through organisers. So coming up next in terms of our live stuff, we've got our next stops on tour is November 12th to Macro Art up in Cambridge, where we're learning all about graphics and seeing how that's all done. And we've got an Ops Nest live at Christmas as well, on top of all of our usual stuff.
Fantastic. So, guys, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion, and best of luck to each of you with your respective projects that you've got coming up.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
So fantastic panel about rebuilding fairly. Thanks everyone who watched live and also who's watching on demand. And I guess look out on the OpsNest social media and my social media for further programs. Hope you have the rest of the great Tuesday. Thank you so much.